Caleb was 12 years old, and he had already decided that Vrath was the strangest planet he had ever lived on. Not that he had lived on many. Before Vrath, there had been the orbital station near Jupiter, where his father worked for 2 years, and before that, their small apartment in Colorado. But Vrath was different from both of those places in every possible way. The sky was a deep violet color during the day and turned a burning orange at night. The rocks on the mountain ridges glowed faintly after sunset, like they had swallowed pieces of starlight and were slowly letting them out. The wind made a low humming sound that Caleb had not been able to sleep through for the first 3 weeks. His father, a quiet man named George, worked as a geologist for a colonial survey company. The company had sent him to Vaserth to study the mineral composition of the mountain range that ran along the northern edge of the human settlement. George was good at his job. He spent most of his days collecting rock samples and running numbers on his equipment, and he trusted Caleb to stay close to the station and not cause trouble. Caleb was usually good at following that rule. Usually. The storm that rolled in on the 42nd evening of their stay on Vrath was not like the storms back on Earth. It did not bring rain. It brought pressure, a heavy, tight feeling in the air that made Caleb's ears ache and his chest feel like something was sitting on it. The sky turned a color that had no good name, somewhere between green and gray, and the humming of the wind rose into something closer to a wail. George had told Caleb to stay inside and had gone to secure the survey equipment before the storm hit fully. Caleb had intended to stay inside. He genuinely had. But then he heard something. It was not the wind. The wind had a pattern to it, a rhythm that Caleb's ears had slowly learned over the weeks. This sound was different. It was a low, broken pulse, almost like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere down the slope behind the station. Caleb pressed his face against the thick observation window and stared into the darkening landscape. He could not see anything unusual, just rocks and the faint glow of the ridge lines and the violet-gray storm pressing down from above. He heard it again. Caleb pulled on his jacket, the heavy insulated one his father had made him bring, even though Colorado habits said it was unnecessary. He told himself he would only go a short distance, just to the edge of the flat area behind the station, just to see. The wind hit him the moment he stepped outside, pushing against him like a hand trying to send him back in. He leaned into it and walked toward the slope. The sound grew slightly clearer as he moved, not louder exactly, but more present, like it was reaching toward him. He picked his way carefully between the rocks, using the faint glow of the ridge to keep his sense of direction. He almost missed it completely. The ravine was narrow, barely 2 meters wide, cut into the slope like a crack in old wood. Caleb would have walked right past it if his boot had not slipped on the edge and sent a small shower of pebbles tumbling down into the dark below. He caught himself on a rock, heart jumping, and looked down. There was something at the bottom of the ravine. It was roughly the size of a large watermelon, oval-shaped, and it sat wedged between 2 rocks, as though it had fallen there and been unable to move. In the dim light of the storm, Caleb could see that it had a surface that was neither smooth nor rough. It had a texture like overlapping leaves or maybe scales, each one catching what little light existed and holding it for a moment before letting it go. It glowed very faintly, so faintly that Caleb almost convinced himself he was imagining it. But it was also clearly losing that glow. Even as he watched, the light in it flickered, the way a screen flickers when the power is going out. Caleb climbed down into the ravine without thinking about it very much. The walls were close enough that he could brace himself between them and lower himself carefully. The bottom was cold, much colder than the surface, and the wind did not reach down here. It was very quiet. The pulse sound was clear now, steady but weak, and it was definitely coming from the oval object. He crouched in front of it and looked at it closely. It was an egg. Caleb had no idea what kind of egg it was. He had never seen anything like it. But it was absolutely an egg. The shape, the surface, the way it seemed to contain something rather than simply being a solid object. And it was cold. When he carefully pressed the back of his hand against its surface, the chill went straight through his skin. The glow flickered again, weaker this time. Caleb did not spend a long time thinking about what to do next. Something alive was in trouble. That was a simple fact, and it did not seem to require a complicated response. He unzipped his jacket and pressed the egg carefully against his chest, then zipped the jacket back up around it as best he could. It was heavy and awkward, and the shape made it difficult, but he managed. Then he climbed back out of the ravine, leaned into the storm wind, and walked back toward the station. By the time he got inside and set the egg gently under the portable heat lamp from his father's equipment case, his hands were shaking from the cold, and his heart was beating very fast. The egg's glow, pressed close against the warmth, began very slowly to return. Caleb sat on the floor beside it and watched, and for reasons he could not have explained, he felt like he had done exactly the right thing. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually done. The egg glowed through the night. Caleb sat beside it for a long time, watching the light inside it pulse slowly, like something breathing. It reminded him of the way a heartbeat looks on a monitor, steady and quiet and deeply alive. The heat lamp kept the temperature around it warm and even, and as the hours passed, the glow grew stronger and more consistent. By the time the storm outside had settled into a low groan and the orange night sky of Vrath began to show through the window, the egg looked completely different from the dim, flickering thing he had pulled out of the ravine. It looked healthy, whatever healthy meant for something like this. Caleb finally fell asleep on the floor beside it sometime before dawn, his jacket folded under his head, one hand resting near the base of the egg without quite touching it. That was how his father found him in the morning. George stood in the doorway of Caleb's small room for a long moment, saying nothing. He was a tall man with tired eyes and a habit of going very still when he was thinking seriously about something. He looked at his son sleeping on the floor. He looked at the egg sitting under the heat lamp, glowing softly in the pale morning light. He looked at the mud on Caleb's boots and the dirt on his jacket, and the general evidence of a 12-year-old who had definitely not stayed inside during the storm. George sat down slowly on the edge of Caleb's bed and waited. When Caleb woke up and found his father watching him, his first instinct was to explain very quickly. He told the whole story in one long breath. The sound he heard, the ravine, the egg going dim, the cold. George listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, his father was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then George said carefully that they needed to figure out what kind of egg it was before they did anything else. Caleb agreed immediately because that sounded reasonable. What he did not fully register was the particular tone his father used when he said it. The tone of a man who suspected he already knew the answer and was not entirely comfortable with it. George spent most of that morning on his communication console, searching databases and sending quiet inquiries to the Colonial Authority Office 2 settlements over. He did not tell Caleb exactly what he was looking for, and Caleb did not push, because he was too busy watching the egg. The egg had begun to do something new. It moved. Not dramatically. It did not roll or shake or crack. But every so often, maybe once every 20 minutes or so, the surface of it would shift very slightly. The overlapping scale-like texture would ripple, a slow wave moving from the bottom of the egg to the top, and then settle again. It was subtle enough that Caleb might have doubted himself if he had not been watching so closely. He started keeping track, marking the time of each ripple in a small notebook he used for school assignments. He also started talking to it. This was not something he planned or decided to do. It simply happened. At first, he just described what he was seeing. The ripple at 9:40, the ripple at 10, the way the glow shifted slightly warmer in color as the morning went on. Then, because silence felt strange, he started talking about other things. He told the egg about Colorado, about the way snow looked on the mountains in winter, and the way his school had smelled like old wood and cafeteria food. He told it about the orbital station near Jupiter, about how the stars looked from there with no atmosphere softening them. He told it about Vrath, about the humming wind and the glowing rocks and the violet sky. He called the egg Rex, because it needed a name and that one felt right. On the other side of the planet's star system, something very different was happening. The Drakari royal court existed on a world called Vashan Prime, a planet so old that its mountain ranges had worn down to gentle hills over millions of years. The Drakari themselves were ancient in the same way, not just long-lived, but carrying the weight of a civilization that had existed before most other species in the galaxy had learned to make fire. They were large, scaled, and deeply proud, and they did not panic easily. But on this particular morning, the royal court was as close to panic as it ever allowed itself to get. Queen Vaserth had not slept. She stood at the center of the great chamber, her gold and dark scales catching the light of the twin suns through the high windows, and she held herself very still in the way that meant she was controlling something large inside her. Around her, advisors and guards moved carefully, speaking in low voices, none of them willing to be the one standing directly in front of her when she finally let the stillness go. The air egg was gone. It had been moved during the night for a routine warming cycle in the outer chamber, as it had been moved many times before. But when the attendants went to return it to the royal nest before dawn, the chamber was empty. The attendant who discovered this had spent several minutes simply standing and staring before finding the courage to report it. Commander Vrath, the head of the royal guard, stood before the queen now and delivered his initial report in a flat, controlled voice. There were no signs of forced entry. No external disturbance had been recorded. The working assumption was an inside action, a faction within the court, of which there were several who had reasons to want the line of succession disrupted. Vrath had already begun a full search of Vashan Prime and the surrounding settlements. Every Drakari noble house would be investigated. Every cargo ship that had left the system in the past day was being tracked. He did not mention the human settlement on Vaserth. It did not occur to him to mention it. The idea that a human could have the egg, or would even recognize one, was not a possibility that entered his mind. Queen Vaserth listened to the full report without moving. When Vrath finished, she asked one question. She asked how long the egg could survive without proper warmth before the hatchling inside was lost. Vrath told her the answer quietly. The queen turned and looked out the high window at the twin suns and said nothing more. Back on Vaserth, Caleb recorded the egg's 9th ripple in his notebook, told Rex about the time he had tried to build a telescope from a kit and gotten the lenses completely wrong, and did not notice his father standing in the doorway behind him, staring at the egg with an expression that was equal parts worry and something that looked almost like awe. The crack appeared on the 3rd day. Caleb saw it first thing in the morning, before he had even eaten breakfast. He had developed a habit of checking the egg the moment he woke up, the same way some people check their phones or look out the window at the weather. He came into the room, crouched beside the heat lamp, and there it was. A thin line running from the middle of the egg down toward the base, no wider than a hair, but unmistakably there. His heart jumped. He called his father immediately, loud enough that George came at a half-run from the other room. They both crouched beside the egg and looked at the crack without speaking for a moment. George reached out and very carefully ran one finger along it, barely touching the surface. The crack was warm, he said quietly. Warmer than the rest of the shell. Caleb did not know what that meant scientifically, but it felt like good news. Everything about the egg lately felt like good news. The glow had been getting stronger every day, shifting from a pale, cold light to something deeper and richer, almost golden. The ripples on the surface had been coming more frequently, too, every few minutes now instead of every 20. And sometimes, if Caleb sat very close and the room was very quiet, he thought he could hear something from inside. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure, a feeling that something was listening. George had finally received a response from the Colonial Authority 2 days earlier. The response had been brief, and it told him very little, except that his inquiry had been forwarded to a Drakari diplomatic contact and that he should avoid disturbing the egg in any way while they waited for further guidance. George had read this message several times and then looked at his son, who had by that point named the egg, built it a small nest out of folded thermal blankets, and was in the middle of reading aloud to it from a geography book. George had decided not to say anything alarming until he had more information. Now he looked at the crack and quietly decided that more information might be arriving sooner than expected. By midday, the crack had become 3 cracks, spreading out from the same point like rivers on a map. The golden glow was pushing through them now, brighter at the edges of each line, and the surface of the egg was moving constantly, a slow, continuous ripple that ran over the whole shell like water disturbed by something underneath. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor in front of it and did not move. He had stopped talking. It felt like a moment that needed quiet. George brought him a sandwich and set it beside him without a word. The egg hatched in the early afternoon. It did not explode or shatter the way things broke in action films. It came apart carefully, almost deliberately, the cracks widening and the pieces of shell separating and falling away one by one, as though each piece had been waiting for permission to let go. The golden light that had been building inside spilled out slowly, filling the small room with warmth. And then the hatchling was simply there. It was small. That was the first thing Caleb registered. Given the size of the egg, he had somehow expected something larger, but the creature that emerged was no bigger than a medium-sized dog, folded in on itself and trembling slightly from the effort of hatching. Its scales were gold, not the dull, flat gold of old coins, but a living gold that shifted between shades as it moved, bright at the edges and deep at the center. Its wings were pressed close against its back, still damp and soft-looking. Its tail curled instinctively around its own body. Then it opened its eyes. They were amber-colored and very clear, and they moved immediately and directly to Caleb's face, as though there was nothing else in the room worth looking at. The hatchling went completely still. Caleb went completely still. For several seconds, neither of them moved at all. Then the hatchling made a sound. It was not a roar or a screech. It was something closer to the sound a cat makes when it is small and uncertain, a short, questioning noise that seemed to be asking something very specific. Caleb answered without thinking. He said hello softly and told it that it was okay and that it was warm here and safe. The hatchling blinked once. Then it uncurled itself slowly, on legs that were still unsteady, and walked across the floor and pressed itself against Caleb's side. Caleb sat very still and let it. George, watching from the doorway, felt the hair on his arms stand up. He had done enough research in the past 3 days to understand what he was witnessing. In Drakari culture, the moment after hatching was not a small thing. The first bonding look, the first creature a hatchling chose to fix its eyes on and move toward, was considered one of the most sacred events in their entire tradition. It was the foundation of a hatchling's first loyalty, woven into its identity at the deepest level. His 12-year-old son had just become the first loyalty of a Drakari hatchling. George walked very quietly to his console and sent an urgent follow-up message to the colonial authority. He kept the language calm and factual because he was that kind of man, but between the lines of the message the meaning was clear enough. Things had moved forward, he wrote, significantly. Back on the floor, Caleb had carefully, slowly, lifted one hand and rested it gently on the hatchling's back. The scales were warm and smooth, and the hatchling leaned into the touch the way Rex had leaned into the warmth of the heat lamp. Caleb smiled without meaning to. He told Rex that he had been waiting for this, and that he was really glad it had finally happened. The hatchling made the small, questioning sound again, quieter this time, like an answer. Outside the station, the violet sky of Vaserth moved toward evening, and neither of them noticed. The warship arrived on the 5th day. Caleb saw it from the observation window in the morning, a dark shape descending through the violet sky, far too large and far too deliberate to be anything that belonged to the human settlement. It was the color of deep water, long and angular, with swept-back structures along its sides that caught the light in a way that made it look like it was always moving, even when it was standing still. It landed on the flat ground a short distance from the station with a sound that Caleb felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. He had been feeding Rex when he noticed it. Rex had turned out to be a very enthusiastic eater, interested in almost anything Caleb offered, and completely uninterested in eating unless Caleb was sitting close by. George had found some protein-rich ration packs in the supply store that the hatchling seemed to like, and mornings had developed into a routine. Caleb on the floor, Rex pressed against his leg, eating from a bowl while Caleb talked quietly about whatever came to mind. When Caleb stood up and moved to the window, Rex immediately followed and pressed against the back of his legs, looking up at him with those clear, amber eyes. Caleb told Rex to stay close, in the same calm voice he used for everything. Rex stayed close. George was already at the console, watching the landing on the external sensors. His face had the very still expression that meant he was thinking hard and fast. He had received a short message from the Colonial Authority an hour earlier, telling him that a Drakari Royal Guard vessel was en route and that he should cooperate fully and avoid any action that could be interpreted as hostile. The message had also told him, in careful diplomatic language, that the situation was considered extremely sensitive. George had read the message, looked at his son and the small golden creature sleeping against his son's feet, and felt the specific weight of a parent who understands that something large is about to arrive and cannot be stopped. He told Caleb what was coming as honestly as he could. He explained that the egg had belonged to the Drakari. He explained that the Drakari were powerful and ancient and did not have a simple history with human settlers. He explained that soldiers were going to come to the station and that Caleb needed to be calm and cooperative and let the adults handle the conversation. Caleb listened to all of this carefully. Then he looked down at Rex, who was awake now and watching both of them with alert amber eyes, and asked one question. He asked if they were going to take Rex away. George said he did not know. Caleb nodded slowly and said nothing more, but he reached down and rested his hand on Rex's back, and Rex pressed upward into the touch, and George looked away from that because it made the conversation harder. The soldiers came 20 minutes later. There were 6 of them, and they were large. Drakari in military roles were broader and heavier than the images Caleb had seen in school materials, and their armor was a dark color that seemed to pull light toward it rather than reflect it. They moved with the kind of precision that came from long practice, and they did not seem interested in the station or in George. Their eyes went immediately to Rex. Commander Vrath came in behind them. He was older than the soldiers, with darker scales along his jaw and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything in the room with the automatic efficiency of someone who had spent decades assessing threats. He looked at George first, then at Caleb, then at Rex. Rex looked back at him and made a sound that Caleb had not heard before, low and sharp, completely different from the soft, questioning noises he made around Caleb. Rex stepped forward until it was directly in front of Caleb, between Caleb and the soldiers, and the small golden body was very tense. Vrath spoke. His translator unit rendered his words into flat, even English. He said that the hatchling would come with them now, and that the human boy should step away. One of the soldiers moved forward. Rex reacted immediately. The hatchling dropped low, spread its wings, still soft, still not fully developed, but wider than Caleb had realized, and produced a sound that filled the room completely. It was not loud in a simple way. It had a quality to it that went past the ears and landed somewhere deeper, and every person in the room stopped moving. The soldier stopped. The other soldiers stopped. Vrath stopped. Rex held its position in front of Caleb, wings spread, and did not make another sound. The message was clear without any translation. Vrath stared at the hatchling for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a recalculation. A soldier assessed what he saw, and what he saw was a royal hatchling in full protective stance over a human child. He had served the crown for 30 years, and he had never seen anything close to this. He took one slow step back and held up one hand to keep his soldiers still. Then he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone in the room, that this was not something he had authority to resolve. George let out a breath he had been holding for several minutes. Caleb had not moved during any of it. He stood behind Rex with his hand resting lightly between the hatchling's wings, and his face was calm in the way that children are sometimes calm in frightening situations. Not because they are unafraid, but because the thing they care about is right in front of them, and being afraid feels less important than being steady. He told Rex quietly that it was all right. Rex did not relax completely, but the wings folded back slowly, and the terrible sound did not return. Vrath stepped outside and opened a long-range communication channel, and his voice, when he spoke into it, was carefully neutral in the way of a man delivering news he does not fully know how to frame. He told the Queen that she needed to come herself. Queen Vaserth arrived on the 7th day. Her ship was nothing like the warship that Vrath had come in. It was enormous and slow-moving and completely silent, the way very large things sometimes are, as though their size alone is enough and speed is something for smaller creatures to worry about. It was a deep gold color, darker than Rex's scales, and it caught the light of Vrath's sun in a way that made it look less like a vehicle and more like something that had always been there and was only now becoming visible. The whole settlement came outside to watch it land. George stood at the door of the station with his arms folded and his face very still. Caleb stood beside him with Rex pressed against his leg. The hatchling had been calm since the previous day, after Vrath and his soldiers had stepped back and kept a respectful distance from the station. But now, with the Queen's ship descending, Rex lifted its head and made a low sound that Caleb had not heard before. Something between recognition and uncertainty, like hearing a familiar voice from very far away. Caleb rested his hand on Rex's back and said nothing. He had learned that sometimes Rex just needed to feel that he was there. Queen Vaserth came out of the ship alone. Caleb had tried to prepare himself by looking at images in the colonial database the night before, but nothing in the database had fully prepared him for the reality of her. She was the largest living thing he had ever seen outside of a nature documentary. Her scales were gold and dark green, layered like armor that had grown rather than been made, and she moved with a slowness that was not weakness, but weight. The weight of something that had existed for a very long time, and had learned that most things were not worth hurrying for. Her eyes were a deep amber color, darker than Rex's, and they missed nothing. She crossed the flat ground between her ship and the station and stopped at a distance that felt considered, close enough to speak, far enough to not overwhelm. She looked at Caleb first, then she looked at Rex. Rex looked back at her and was very still. For a moment, nobody moved and nobody spoke. The wind made its low humming sound across the rocks, and the morning light sat flat and pale across the landscape, and the whole scene felt like a breath being held. Then the Queen spoke. Her voice was deep and even, and the translator unit that Vrath had placed near the station door rendered her words carefully. She said that she had been told what happened, and that she had come to see it for herself before she decided anything. George stepped forward and introduced himself and Caleb in a steady voice. He explained the situation simply and accurately. The storm, the ravine, the egg going cold, Caleb's decision to bring it back. He did not try to make it sound more than it was, and he did not apologize for it either. The Queen listened without interrupting. When George finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked directly at Caleb and asked him to tell her himself. Caleb felt the weight of those amber eyes and understood in a simple, wordless way that this was not a moment for anything except the truth. So he told her. He said that he heard something in the storm and followed the sound. He said that the egg was cold and dim, and that it looked like it was losing whatever it had inside it. He said that he did not know what it was, but that it was clearly alive and clearly in trouble, and that he could not walk away from something like that. The Queen asked him what he had wanted from it. Caleb looked at her with an expression that was genuinely confused by the question. He said he had not wanted anything from it. He said he just wanted it to be okay. The Queen looked at him for a long time after that. Long enough that Caleb started to wonder if he had said something wrong. But the expression on her face, which was difficult to read because her face was not built the way human faces were, did not look like anger. It looked like something harder to name. Then Rex walked forward. The hatchling moved past Caleb slowly and crossed the ground toward the queen and stopped a short distance in front of her. Queen Vaserth lowered her great head until it was close to the level of the hatchling, and they regarded each other in silence. Rex made the low, uncertain sound again, and the queen answered it softly in a tone that needed no translation. It was the sound of something ancient and maternal, recognizing what it had almost lost. Then Rex turned around and walked back to Caleb and sat down beside him. The queen raised her head and was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter and more deliberate, as though each word was being chosen with great care. She said that in 500 years, she had given many titles and made many rulings, and that most of them had been driven by politics or strategy or the long calculations of power. She said that what she was about to do was driven by none of those things. She said that by Drakari law, the bonding of a hatchling was sacred and could not be undone without harm to the hatchling's development and identity. She said that the boy had, without knowing it, fulfilled the role of first warmth, the one who keeps the fire going when the fire is nearly out. She said that she was granting Caleb the title of Venkara. Vrath, standing to the side, went very still. One of his soldiers made a small, involuntary sound and then went silent. George looked at his son and then looked at the queen and understood from the reaction of the soldiers alone that something large had just happened, even before the translation finished. Caleb did not know what the title meant. He asked, politely, what it was. The queen said it meant first warmth. She said it was the oldest ceremonial title in Drakari tradition, given to the one who protects the fire of a royal life at its most vulnerable. She said no one outside the Drakari had ever held it. Caleb thought about this for a moment. Then he asked, very carefully, if it meant that Rex would be okay and that he would still be able to see him. The queen looked at him. Something moved behind her ancient eyes that might have been the closest she ever came to being caught off guard. She said yes. She said that was exactly what it meant. Caleb nodded and said that sounded good to him. George put one hand on his son's shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. In the weeks that followed, things began to change in ways that moved slowly, but did not stop. Diplomatic doors that had been closed for decades opened quietly. Other species watched with great attention as the Drakari, proud and ancient and famously unmovable, extended a formal role to a human child on a small colony planet. Scholars wrote about it. Politicians discussed it carefully. The Drakari said very little publicly, which was itself a kind of statement. Caleb did not follow any of this closely. He was 12, and the large movements of galactic politics were not yet things he had the vocabulary for. What he understood was smaller and more immediate. He had permission to visit the Drakari homeworld. Rex would be brought to Vrath during the early development years, and he was expected to take the role of Venkara seriously, which mostly seemed to mean being present and steady and honest, all of which he felt he could manage. On the last evening before Queen Vaserth's ship departed, Caleb sat on the rocky cliffs behind the station with Rex beside him. The sky was doing its evening thing, burning orange at the edges and deepening to purple at the center, and the ridgelines below them were beginning their slow, faint glow. Rex sat with its wings folded neatly and its amber eyes on the horizon, and Caleb sat with his knees pulled up and his hands loose in his lap. He told Rex that he still could not believe any of this had happened from one walk in a storm. Rex turned and looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. Caleb smiled and looked back at the sky. Neither of them spoke after that because nothing more needed to be said, and the stars were beginning to appear above Vrath one by one, each one sharp and clean and very far away, and the universe felt for just that moment like something that had room in it for all kinds of unexpected things.